A torrent of turbolaser fire spiraled across the darkness above the forest moon of Endor as the Executor's prow pitched downward, nose first, driven by raging flames and the lethal vacuum it carved through. Smaller starfighters broke formation to evade the dying behemoth's final descent, and on board every rebel vessel, shouts of triumph erupted at the sight of the Empire's mightiest warship tilting fatally toward the surface of the Death Star. Admiral Akbar, in the command center of Home One, leaned forward, pressing the comlink closer to his mouth, issuing frantic orders to maximize the advantage. The Executor was going down. The momentum had swung in the rebels' favor, or so it seemed. Among the burning wreckage that littered space, pilot transmissions crackled through the fleet's comm channels. A-wings, X-wings, B-wings, and Y-wings darted in tight attack formations against the battered Star Destroyers. TIE fighters had begun to retreat into disorganized pockets, forced to attempt frantic last stands as entire wings were picked off. In that moment, it felt as if the heroic final push of the Alliance would bring them closer to toppling the Empire forever. At the heart of the Death Star's main reactor chamber, Luke Skywalker clutched desperately to his father, Darth Vader, whose mechanical breathing rasped with pain. The Emperor's laughter echoed viciously, and the sizzling glow of his Sith lightning crackled across the damaged walkway. Vader had just intercepted that lightning to save Luke. Yet only seconds before, something like clarity, compassion, or a distant recollection of Anakin Skywalker had fueled him. He stumbled forward, determined to put an end to Emperor Palpatine. But at the crucial moment, as Vader heaved the Emperor over the precipice, Palpatine's ancient eyes widened, and a fresh torrent of jagged energy burst from his fingertips, lashing at Vader's helmet and chest panel. Vader staggered, stumbling backward, his half-lifted arms failing to cling to Palpatine's robes. Luke, sprawled on the floor, watched in horror as the lightning coruscated around his father's armor. It was a savage electricity that pried open each fault in the life support system, penetrated each vulnerable cybernetic link. The Emperor, hissing in indignation, contorted in midair. He was not yet thrown. Vader's hold on him slipped. His mind, fueled by centuries of dark knowledge, unleashed a wave of supernatural power. He stabilized himself for a heartbeat. Vader gave one last push, but he was too drained, his mechanical limbs too damaged. The Emperor twisted in midair, forcing Vader's arms aside with one final jolt. At that instant, Vader slumped to one knee, powerless. The wrathful Emperor landed in a violent swirl of black cloak. The smell of ozone sizzled the air. Luke tried to rise but found that his own limbs refused to respond. Through half-lidded eyes, he saw Palpatine aiming a withering glare. "So," the Emperor snarled, "it appears that you both need a lesson in loyalty." Lightning erupted again, lacing Vader's broken helmet with arcs of incandescent fury. The towering Sith Lord collapsed, sparks dancing around his skeletal frame visible through the shattered mask. A horrifying rasp crackled from the vocoder as Vader attempted to breathe. Luke screamed, and the echo of that sound traveled across the walkway, powerless and unheeded. It reached only the Emperor's ears, and his next guttural laugh sent cold dread through the chamber. From the vantage of Rebel Command inside Home One, no one knew of this unfolding personal disaster yet. Instead, celebrations flickered. The Death Star's hull had been punctured in key areas, and the Executor was plummeting. The TIE screens were thinning. Lando Calrissian, in the cockpit of the Millennium Falcon, soared across the surface of the massive station, forging a path to its core. The plan was to breach it, destroy the main reactor, and make good on the chance given to them by Han Solo and the strike team destroying the shield generator below. But in the next moment, everything changed. Admiral Akbar's wide eyes fixed on an ominous flicker in hyperspace. Space itself seemed to tear open. Alarms blared across the Rebel flagship. Sensor operators shouted, one after another, that multiple large signatures were emerging from hyperspace at close range. Far closer than they should have been able to. A monstrous dagger-shaped silhouette slid into reality, dwarfing even the Executor. It was the Eclipse, a superstar destroyer that not even the Rebel intelligence had known was completed. Rumors had swirled for months, Talk of a new superweapon or flagship far beyond the Executor's scale, but it had never been confirmed. Now its hull, a black, angular shape, swallowed starlight and exuded an aura of dread. As if that wasn't enough, behind it came a formation of at least 40 Imperial Star Destroyers, each dropping in with predatory grace, arraying themselves around the eclipse like guardian beasts. In an instant, the triumphant mood vanished. Despair quaked through the entire alliance. "The eclipse? It's real," someone whispered in the background of Home One's bridge. Akbar's voice deepened with grave resolve. "All ships, prepare to regroup. We must retreat if necessary." But it was already too late for a clean escape. The gargantuan eclipse angled to present its forward axis on the battlefield. The black apex was studded with newly designed turbolasers of immense destructive power, rumored to be more potent than anything fielded on the Executor. In an uncanny demonstration, the main cannon fired a single shot. A dazzling lance of emerald energy obliterated an entire rebel frigate in a thunderous blow. There was no chance for the frigate's crew to react. One moment, the vessel's silhouette was visible. The next, the main shot had torn it apart in a scatter of molten metal and explosive atmosphere. Panic and horror spread through rebel ranks. On the comm channels, pilots screamed as they saw the remains of their comrades catapult into the cold void. Another volley followed, systematically targeting the heart of the rebel formation. 1, 2, 3 large capital ships were struck in quick succession, each vanishing in a cloud of shattered durasteel. Then the swarm of TIE advanced fighters emerged, thousands of them, a black tide unleashed from the eclipse and the newly arrived Star Destroyers. Advanced targeting systems glowed bright inside their cockpits, state-of-the-art improvements that dwarfed the older TIE/LN or TIE Interceptor models. They soared forth in a disciplined wave. Immediately, their green lasers cut through rebel starfighters. X-wings and A-wings burst into flames under the precise assault. Pilots scrambled to reorganize, but the sheer numbers of TIE advanced craft began to overwhelm them. The disjointed calls for retreat or reformation assaulted Akbar's command console. "We're being overrun," shouted one pilot, narrowly evading a TIE's volley. "They're flanking us on all sides. We've lost half of Red Squadron." The voice dissolved in static. Another pilot was gone. More scattered pleas replaced it, each more desperate than the last. Akbar forced himself to remain calm. He issued orders. "All wings, focus on fighter suppression. Capital ships, aim for the new arrivals. We have to buy time for the strike team and for General Calrissian." Even in that moment of crisis, Akbar couldn't bring himself to fully abandon the cause. If the strike inside the Death Star still succeeded, perhaps they could detonate the station and cause a chain reaction that would consume a portion of the Imperial fleet. But Akbar knew, deep down, that with the arrival of the eclipse, the heart of the Empire was far from broken. The frantic swirl of starfighter combat continued. The newly arrived Star Destroyers advanced in a relentless wedge formation. Their turbolasers pounded away at Mon Calamari cruisers. Ion cannons hammered in response, and for a moment, a furious exchange lit up the vacuum between them. An Imperial formation of TIE advanced craft raked the ventral side of a Nebulan B medical frigate with laser fire, severing its bridge and leaving the vessel to drift helplessly. Inside the Death Star, Emperor Palpatine let his lightning cease. The sudden silence was somehow more terrible than the crackling energy. Vader lay sprawled, his breathing apparatus failing. Sparks and smoke rose from the gashes in his armor. His severed hand from the duel was still missing, a stump of charred metal. Luke gasped for air, forcing his battered body to stand. Summoning the Force, he tried to call his lightsaber from the floor, but with a serpentine flick of the Emperor's hand, the weapon skittered away. "You are beaten, young Skywalker," the Emperor said softly, the malice in his voice cold as the grave. "The Alliance is scattered. Your pitiful rebellion will soon be nothing but a memory. Look and see your fleet burn." With a gesture that seemed too easy, as if he were drawing aside a curtain, the Emperor triggered a hidden holodisplay panel on the walkway's console. Through the holographic projection, the cataclysm outside was shown. The eclipse unleashing its next volley, rebel ships shattered one after another. Despite his physical pain, Luke felt a stronger anguish seeing that projection. So many lives, so much hope, destroyed in seconds. He tried to steady himself, to center on the Force for an answer. But Palpatine's power loomed all around, a crushing weight saturating the Death Star's corridors. "You can still be spared," the Emperor offered in a deceptive purr. "Join me. Learn the true nature of the Force. Take your father's place at my side, and all shall be forgiven." Luke's eyes flickered with sorrow as he glanced at Vader, whose rasping was more labored by the second. He thought of Leia, of Han, of all his friends risking their lives down on Endor. The knowledge that the Emperor was winning, truly winning now, gnawed at his heart. He swallowed, searching for that last shred of hope. "Never," he hissed. "Never. Then die?" The Emperor snarled, lightning once more erupting from his fingertips. Luke tried to bring up his arms, but the pain was immediate. Agony seared through every nerve as the electricity coursed through him. He fought to breathe, to push back with the Force. Yet the Emperor's power, bolstered by the dark energies swirling within the station's reactor space, overwhelmed Luke's defenses. Vader stirred in the corner of his vision. Perhaps there was still a chance that Vader's paternal instinct, newly awakened, could intervene. Luke yearned for that final redemption. He reached out through the Force, silently calling, "Father, Father, please." Vader twitched but could not rise. His damaged body jerked helplessly. The Emperor felt Vader's attempt at betrayal again, and with a final, punishing wave, he redirected the lightning from Luke to Vader once more. The crackle of it scorched fresh burns through the black armor. Vader's modulator hissed, sparks danced across the floor, and the Sith Lord collapsed, finally still. "You dare to challenge me?" Palpatine's voice vibrated with unstoppable rage. He turned back to Luke, whose arms had dropped to his sides, struggling to remain upright. "Goodbye, young Skywalker." The final, lethal bolt tore through Luke's heart. In that instant, he found a fleeting tranquility, a vision of Obi-Wan, of Yoda, of the friends he loved. He fell wordlessly, his body sagged to the floor, the flicker of life in his eyes drained. The Force, swirling with a mixture of sorrow and acceptance, released its hold on Luke Skywalker in that suffocating chamber. In that silent aftermath, Emperor Palpatine let out a slow exhalation, as though savoring the moment. The last of the Jedi had perished at his hand. Vader's breath rattled once more, then ceased. A hush fell upon the corridor. Two smoldering husks, father and son, lay silent on the cold deck. The Emperor stood above them, alone. Outside, the eclipse continued its merciless barrage. Mon Calamari cruisers tried to mount some form of organized retreat, but each time a capital ship realigned for hyperspace calculations, the eclipse's main battery targeted it. The unstoppable green beam pierced shields as though they were flimsy. Another bright explosion illuminated the swirling debris fields. The Millennium Falcon within the superstructure was close to the reactor chamber. They did not know of Luke's death, nor the Emperor's survival. They pressed on, hopeful. Lando's voice rang out, "Almost there. We'll have this reactor in no time." Nien Nunb answered in excited Celestes, pointing to the readouts that glowed on the Falcon's console. The initial infiltration had gone smoothly. Despite heavy TIE presence, the Falcon was weaving through the labyrinth of corridors and tunnels. They arrived at the main reactor. Lando's eyebrows lifted in relief and determination, seeing the bright column of energy. He set the ship's weapons to full power. "Let's blow this thing and go home," he cried. Missiles launched into the chamber, scoring direct hits on the reactor's external stabilizers. The subsequent chain reaction began to flicker. "Now we get out of here," Lando shouted, spinning the Falcon in a desperate pivot to exit the reactor chamber before it collapsed. The explosion started as planned, but then Lando's scanners shrieked with an alert. "This is going too fast," he muttered. The plan had always been to allow enough time to exit, but something was interfering. That was when the Emperor himself, attuned to the station systems through the dark side, exercised his final contingency. safeguards that had remained inactive until that moment slammed into place. From his vantage in the throne room walkway, Palpatine accessed the Death Star's control systems, channeling the Force in a way that demanded extreme concentration. "You will not destroy my creation," he seethed. With the flick of a switch on a private console, backup coolant lines flooded the reactor. Emergency bulkheads sealed, containing the initial blasts. The reactor meltdown that the rebels counted on would not progress to the catastrophic conclusion. Instead, the chain reaction was smothered in mid-ignition. The entire station shuddered as additional structural reinforcements clamped down across miles of superstructure. Thus, the meltdown that was supposed to obliterate the Death Star ended in a half-failure. Some decks collapsed, causing local devastation, but the main reactor remained intact enough to prevent total destruction. The explosion that did take place was serious but not lethal to the entire station. Flames burst across multiple sections of the superstructure, leaving molten scars. But the Death Star itself continued to function, albeit wounded, still able to power crucial systems. In the Falcon, Lando's relief turned to disbelief. The entire ship lurched as the partial explosion reverberated. "Why isn't this place going up?" Lando shouted, wrestling with the controls. The ship rattled violently, nearly clipping a corridor. Smoke from the meltdown's partial blowout clouded visibility. "We've got partial collapse in the superstructure," shouted a frantic Celestes translation from Nien Nunb's console. "But the reactor is still stable enough to keep the station together," Lando interpreted with a worried hiss. "We've got to get out of here anyway. Let's get to the surface and see if the fleet can regroup." But as the Falcon emerged from the Death Star's incomplete meltdown, they discovered a far more horrifying sight. The eclipse overshadowed the battlefield, ringed by the newly arrived Star Destroyers. The Executor's wreckage had collided with a portion of the Death Star's outer surface, leaving a scar of twisted metal. Everywhere Lando looked, he saw drifting hulks of destroyed rebel vessels. The few that remained were locked in a desperate struggle against overwhelming Imperial firepower. Han Solo's strike team had accomplished their mission on Endor's surface, destroying the shield generator. But now that victory was useless, the Death Star remained operational enough to keep the rebels at bay, especially with the eclipse overshadowing everything. The ragtag survivors of the Alliance fleet huddled behind Home One, whose hull was battered and scorched. Lando's heart sank. "We missed something big," he murmured, eyes locked on the black dagger in the distance. On the comm channel, Admiral Akbar's voice came through in static. "Stroyer Group has cut off our hyperspace vector. We cannot break out. All wings, we must ret." The words dissolved. Another blast from the eclipse hammered an MC-80 cruiser, snapping it in two. TIE advanced fighters swarmed the Millennium Falcon. Lando fought them off with the top and bottom turrets, Nien Nunb doing his best to shake their pursuit. The best they could do now was to find any pocket of safety or attempt to jump to hyperspace. But the Imperials, well aware of the rebels' tactics, had interdictor cruisers among the newly arrived Star Destroyers. Hyperspace escape was being systematically prevented. The rebels were trapped. On Endor's surface, Han, Leia, and the strike team had just destroyed the shield generator. They saw the sudden hush in the sky as the shield flickered out. Chewbacca roared triumphantly, and the Ewoks hooted with victory. But then the comm link to orbit erupted with frantic alarms. Leia pressed a hand to her earpiece, face blanching. "Something's wrong," she said. "They're saying a new Imperial fleet arrived. Huge. The station's not destroyed. The Executor is down. But the Emperor has a new ship, the Eclipse." Her voice shook with confusion. "No, Luke." Her words were cut off by static. Han rubbed a hand across his mouth in anxious frustration. "We gotta get up there," he said, though he knew they had no ships on the surface to break the planet's orbit. Even so, the improvised landing platform the Imperials had used was still within a day's march, if it were even still intact. The forest around them felt stifling. Ewoks chittered in question, uncertain of what came next. 3PO asked worriedly, "But, Captain Solo, the fleet was supposed to—" "Oh dear." Another wave of static interrupted the conversation. Far above, the battle's final outcome was becoming clear. The rebel capital ships were scattered or destroyed. The TIE advance swarm had annihilated most of the fighter squadrons. Home 1, the proud Mon Calamari command ship, lay drifting, its shield projectors gone. Admiral Akbar, wounded, had been carried from the burning bridge. An explosion near the dorsal batteries had taken out the last functional turbolasers. Escape pods jettisoned in vain, many of them picked off by the patrolling TIEs. At the heart of this devastation, the Eclipse glided forward, unstoppable. Aboard that black fortress, hundreds of Imperial officers manned advanced targeting consoles, culminating in a single integrated system that dwarfed anything the Empire had used before. The Eclipse's commander, a gaunt man in a crisp Imperial uniform, surveyed the carnage impassively. He was loyal to the Emperor above all else, and now that loyalty bore fruit. The rebellion was dying in orbit of Endor. Back on the Death Star, with the partial meltdown contained, Palpatine took a turbolift from the upper levels of the tower down to an expansive hangar bay. Royal guards flanked him, their crimson robes shining in the flickering emergency lights. The station had sustained more internal damage than he would have preferred, but the core systems still functioned well enough. In his mind's eye, he stretched out across the void, feeling the anguish of dying rebels, the terror that had replaced their hope. He passed the remains of Imperial officers rushing to seal off the damaged corridors, stormtroopers dragging twisted hull plating to patch up the worst structural tears. When Palpatine arrived in the hangar, a shuttle stood ready, flanked by squads of troopers in perfect formation. Word had reached him that the field was won, that the Eclipse's commander offered his personal greetings. The Emperor intended to visit his new flagship personally. Stepping onto the Lambda-class shuttle's ramp, Palpatine paused. He could feel the emptiness in the Force where Vader had once been. That potential traitor was gone. Luke Skywalker was gone. It struck him that for the first time in decades, he alone was the dark side's champion. The Sith lineage now narrowed to him. A cruel smile tugged at his lips. There would be time to search for new apprentices if needed. For now, the galaxy would kneel. The shuttle soared out of the Death Star's docking port, weaving through the debris that drifted in the station's proximity. TIE interceptors and TIE advanced craft escorted it to the Eclipse's bay. Even from the pilot's seat, the scale of this new warship was undeniable. It seemed to blot out the stars as they drew nearer. The docking procedures commenced smoothly, and soon Palpatine was on board. He walked with controlled steps down the Eclipse's grand corridors, lined with dark plating and adorned with minimal lighting that gave the ship an underworld ambience. Awaiting him on the main bridge was a line of officers standing at attention. One stepped forward, bent to one knee, and then rose. "Your Imperial Majesty, we are honored by your presence aboard the Eclipse." Palpatine raised a withered hand, allowing the officer to rise. "Commander," he addressed him, "your timing was impeccable. The rebels allowed themselves to be deceived by the partial vulnerabilities around the second Death Star. We have lured them, and we have crushed them. The galaxy will soon learn of this victory," the officer replied with deep reverence. "With your permission, we shall continue eliminating the remaining rebel vessels. Admiral Piatt gave his life to keep them engaged long enough for us to arrive, and your foreknowledge has proven decisive." Palpatine let a faint, satisfied chuckle slip. "Yes, proceed, Commander. Wipe them out. All of them." At that command, the crew returned to their stations, and the Eclipse's unstoppable cannons lined up new targets. One after another, the battered Alliance ships were finished off or disabled beyond repair. The Millennium Falcon, smaller and more maneuverable, managed to slip out of the kill zone, but it was forced to break away from Home 1, alone and defenseless. "Akbar, do you copy?" Lando's voice filled the comm channel, but only static answered him. That meant the fleet was effectively gone. With each second, TIE advance squads threatened to catch the Falcon in a net of laser fire. "We have to get out of here," Lando murmured, desperately scanning for any hole in the interdictor coverage. "We can't jump if the gravity wells are engaged." Desperate times called for desperate measures. Lando took the Falcon on a mad dash, hugging close to the Death Star's surface to avoid line of sight from the interdictors. TIEs swarmed behind them, chipping away at the Falcon's aft shields. Lando had the advantage of the station's external superstructure. He weaved between spires and turrets as if running an insane obstacle course. Nien Nunb groaned with alarm, and Lando coaxed the ship for one more improbable maneuver. "They can't hold us in real space if they can't keep a stable lock," Lando reasoned. "We'll see if we can slip around to the far side of Endor's moon, break line of sight from their gravity projectors, and jump from the far side, assuming we can survive that long." The odds were laughable, but Lando had no other plan. 12 TIE advanced craft clung to them, relentlessly. The Falcon's upper turret was jammed, leaving only the bottom turret to return fire. Laser bolts hammered the Falcon's stern. A direct hit took out the communications array. Another blow shorted out the hyperdrive motivator. Sparks rained across the cockpit, and the distinctive tone for hyperdrive malfunction screeched. "Not good," Lando yelled, rushing to reroute power from the secondary systems. Nien Nunb was on it, trying to coax life back into the drive. The Falcon soared under one of the Death Star's protruding docking stations, nearly scraping the hull. TIEs collided in the chase, creating brief fireballs behind them, reducing the pursuers by a few. But before they could pull into an orbit behind the moon, a fresh wave of TIE advanced fighters joined the pursuit, directed from the Eclipse by the Emperor's own strategic acumen. Palpatine, monitoring from the Eclipse's bridge, felt a faint tremor in the force around that freighter. He recognized the vessel, the Millennium Falcon. "Skywalker's allies," he muttered. "I sensed them." The Emperor's cold, reptilian eyes narrowed. Perhaps capturing the survivors of that craft would be a suitable coda to this victory. Meanwhile, Endor's forest floor was ablaze in places where fallen debris from the space battle had impacted. Han and Leia, along with a small group of rebels, marched through the jungle with tension in the air. The mood was grim, overshadowed by the faint booms of orbital bombardment. The Empire, now victorious in orbit, was unlikely to spare the forest moon. The question remained, how long until the Empire established total blockade or even retaliated with ground forces? Leia's thoughts spiraled. She sensed a great sorrow through the Force, though her training was minimal. It was as if a bright light had vanished. She clutched her chest, tears welling up. She did not speak of it aloud, but she feared Luke was gone. Han, noticing her expression, tried to soothe her. "Hey, it's going to be all right," he lied. She shook her head. "The Emperor, I can feel his presence," Leia whispered, trembling. "Luke, She couldn't finish. Chewbacca moaned softly, placing a giant paw on Leia's shoulder. The group pressed on in silence, searching for a means to contact any friendly forces or to find a ship that might carry them off-world. Up above, the hours stretched on. The rebel fleet was almost entirely destroyed. Hundreds of escape pods and lifeboats drifted among the wreckage. Stormtrooper boarding teams from the Star Destroyers began to capture the survivors, rounding them up as prisoners. The Empire had carried out Emperor Palpatine's order efficiently. The rebellion was, for all intents and purposes, crushed at Endor. With the blockade secured, the Eclipse drew closer to the Death Star, coordinating final sweeps of the area. Palpatine stood at the forward viewport, gazing upon the carnage with an expression of twisted triumph. He turned slightly as one of his advisors approached, a thin man in gray robes. "Your Majesty," the advisor said, "our forces stand ready to begin a purge of the remaining rebel enclaves. Word will spread quickly across the galaxy that the rebellion has failed here." The Emperor gave a short nod. "Excellent. Dispatch a legion to the moon's surface. I want no survivors among the rebels. Burn the forests if you must." The advisor bowed and hurried away to relay the command. Even as he gave that order, Palpatine reflected on the Death Star. It remained heavily damaged, but salvageable. The main weapon might still be offline for some time, given the meltdown's partial destruction. He debated whether it was worth the resources to fully restore the station. The Eclipse, after all, was a more efficient symbol of power, and the Imperial fleet was vast enough to enforce his rule. Yet, there was a certain pride in having a functional Death Star. Perhaps he would let his engineers decide which path offered the best demonstration of the Empire's might. As for the question of apprenticeship, Palpatine's eyes narrowed. With Vader and Luke gone, he felt only a cold emptiness. Perhaps he would find another Force-sensitive to mold, or perhaps he no longer needed the complication of a second Sith. The Force was his domain alone now. The galaxy would kneel or it would burn. On Endor, TIE shuttles and landing craft descended in great numbers. Han and Leia watched from a hillside vantage as columns of stormtroopers advanced into the forest. AT-ST walkers stomped along, using their heavy cannons to torch Ewok villages. Smoke spiraled above the ancient trees. The Ewoks bravely attempted an ambush, but they were decimated by the new wave of disciplined Imperial retaliation. "This is slaughter," Leia whispered, tears in her eyes as she saw the forest dwellers scattered, villages destroyed. Han's fists tightened. "We have to get out of here," he said, though the futility of that statement made it nearly a whisper. "We don't have the manpower to fight them." A ragged group of rebel commandos, maybe a few dozen at best, assembled around them. Chewbacca let out an enraged roar. The group took stock of their equipment. Blaster rifles, a few grenades, nothing that could take on an entire legion with walkers. Yet they had to try to protect the Ewoks and find a way off the moon. A day's worth of cat-and-mouse fighting ensued. Speeder bike chases, ambushes, and frantic attempts to sabotage Imperial patrols. The rebels managed a few small victories, downing an AT-ST or two with well-placed charges. But there were too many Imperials, and each confrontation forced the rebels to retreat further into the dense forest, losing more of their number. The moon itself began to look like a war-torn wasteland in certain regions, smoke blotting out the sky. Finally, they realized they needed starship transport. One final plan coalesced in Han's mind. The old Imperial landing platform, presumably recaptured. If they could slip past the guards, steal a shuttle, they might escape into orbit. But where would they go from there? The rebel fleet was gone, presumably. Yet, even a chance to flee was better than certain death on Endor. So they embarked on that final infiltration, using their commando skills to bypass roving troopers. They traveled at night, guided by stolen data from a captured stormtrooper's helmet. The platform loomed, illuminated by floodlights. Several large shuttles were landed there with TIE fighter escorts. The rebels clung to the underbrush. Leia paused, pressing her fingers to her temple. "I feel such darkness," she said. She trembled, remembering the earlier sense of loss. For a moment, she felt as though Luke's presence was calling out to her. But it was gone, replaced by a suffocating void. She steadied herself. She had to remain focused. Han scouted the platform perimeter and counted at least 3 platoons of stormtroopers, with turrets set up near the entry ramps. "We can't take them head-on," he muttered. "Chewie, do you think you can create a diversion?" Chewbacca growled, nodding, hefting a stolen rocket launcher. The plan was set into motion. A well-aimed rocket destroyed one of the turrets, throwing the troopers into disarray. The rebels burst from the trees, firing from multiple angles, pinning down the Imperials. For a moment, it worked. The troopers scattered, some returning fire blindly. Han and Leia rushed onto the platform, ducking behind cargo crates. Blaster bolts flew in every direction. Several rebels were cut down by the withering return fire. Leia pressed forward, unwavering, eyes set on one of the shuttles. Her heart pounded, adrenaline surging. The troopers had regrouped quickly, forming a perimeter. A half-dozen from the 501st marched in tight formation, rifles aimed. Leia aimed her blaster, pressing the trigger. She downed 2 troopers before taking a grazing shot to her upper arm. She clenched her teeth, forced herself to ignore the burn. Han took out another pair. The platform was awash in chaos, lasers crossing from both sides. Meanwhile, Chewbacca, carrying the rocket launcher, roared as he fired again, toppling more cargo crates and scattering the Imperials behind them. The rebels took advantage of the confusion to sprint for the shuttle's boarding ramp. Half their group lay motionless behind them, but the survivors pressed on. "Everyone in," Han shouted. They sealed the ramp behind them, dropping the hatch just in time to block incoming blaster fire. Inside, an Imperial pilot turned in alarm, hand reaching for a sidearm. Leia fired and the pilot fell. "We need to get this bucket started," Han said, leaping into the pilot's seat. With a flick, he initiated the pre-flight sequence. He almost expected the cockpit to require codes, but to his relief, it seemed the system recognized an authorized passcode from the pilot's uniform or had been left on standby. Outside, stormtroopers reformed. A mechanical stomping echoed as an AT-ST approached, its cannons zeroing in on the shuttle. The engines whined, slowly powering up. Come on, Han urged, hands dancing over the controls. Leia slid into the co-pilot's seat, ignoring the pain in her arm. Finally, the repulsors kicked in. The shuttle lifted a few meters off the deck. The side cannons fired, forcing the stormtroopers to take cover. The AT-ST unleashed a burst that sizzled the shuttle's shields. Chewbacca howled from behind them, barking about the structural integrity. "Just a little more," Han shouted. Another blast raked the shuttle's hull. Sparks flew inside. The smell of scorched metal choked them, but the engines were online enough to ascend. The stolen shuttle climbed higher, leaving the platform behind. The AT-ST fired in vain, shots trailing beneath as they angled for the atmosphere. Up they went, battered but airborne, pushing through Endor's thick atmosphere. Han wrestled with the controls, forcing the shuttle to climb faster than recommended. Leia scanned for orbital contacts. "I've got multiple star destroyers in high orbit, including that massive one, the Eclipse," she reported. She shuddered. "We can't fight them. We'll have to slip by." Chewbacca barked another concern. Interdictors might still be present. The short-range sensors crackled, showing the formidable cluster of capital ships controlling the entire approach to Endor. "This is insane," Han muttered. "If we try to slip into orbit, we'll get hammered in seconds." Leia paused, quiet, as though listening to something intangible. A strange calm overcame her. "We should try for the far side of the moon," she said. "Like Lando might have tried. It's the only chance." Han nodded. He angled the shuttle in that direction, hoping that the Imperials wouldn't notice them among the dozens of supply shuttles going back and forth. The vantage from the surface was small comfort, though, as he saw TIE fighters patrolling aggressively. Sure enough, within minutes, a pair of TIE advance swooped in behind them, scanning. Han held his breath, hoping their stolen shuttle transponder would fool them. For a moment, the TIEs soared past. "We might have a chance," Han exhaled, but that hope was short-lived. A flash of recognition from an Imperial scanning station must have flagged them. The TIEs whipped around. Blaster bolts streaked by. Alarms rang. "They've locked on," Leia yelled. Han jerked the controls, trying to evade, but a shuttle was far less nimble than a fighter. A direct hit rattled them. Chewbacca roared from the rear, calling out shield levels. Another volley hammered the shuttle, frying the starboard stabilizer. The craft lurched violently, losing altitude in a half-spin. "We're not going to make it to orbit," Leia shouted. The entire hull moaned as though about to break. "Hang on," Han bellowed, fighting the controls. The shuttle spun downward, cutting a diagonal path across the sky. Fire danced across the viewport. They barely maintained altitude long enough to clear a massive ridgeline. Then the ground rushed up to meet them, a sea of towering evergreens. The craft smashed into the treetops, ripping them away in a roar of splintered wood and metal. The fuselage screeched across the ground, eventually skidding to a halt in a wide clearing. Smoke billowed from the wreck, sparks sputtering from the damaged engines. Inside the cockpit, Han and Leia fought their harnesses, battered but alive. Chewbacca had been thrown against the bulkhead, now stirring with a pained growl. The surviving rebel commandos groaned in the cabin, some severely injured. Gasping for breath, Han pressed the emergency hatch release. "Everybody out," he ordered. Flames licked along the shuttle's hull. They staggered outside, leaning on each other for support. So much for their plan of escaping into orbit. The TIEs circled overhead, but for the moment, they seemed satisfied the shuttle was destroyed. The rebels had once again cheated death, but only barely. "Now what?" one commando rasped, scanning the horizon. The sound of TIE engines droned in the distance, accompanied by the heavy footfalls of walkers. The Empire would be on them soon. "We can't keep running forever," Leia whispered, trying to stay strong. She felt the raw ache where the blaster had grazed her. If they were captured, it would mean torture or worse. And with Luke gone, no help was coming. Meanwhile, in orbit, the Millennium Falcon's plight grew direr. Lando and Nien Nunb had taken severe damage, but they managed to locate a small hole in the interdictor's gravity coverage. The cost was high. A group of TIE Advanced had cornered them. Coaxing the hyperdrive into a partial spool, Nien Nunb rerouted power from life support. The cockpit glowed red with emergency lights. Lando gritted his teeth. "We just need a microjump, enough to get us out of their interdiction field. Then we can try for a full jump." But the TIEs hammered them again. One blast shattered the rear deflector. Another clipped an engine. The controls rattled so violently that Lando thought the entire ship would tear itself apart. "Come on, baby, just hold together," he shouted, yanking the levers for the hyperdrive. The TIEs swooped in for a kill shot. Then the Falcon vanished in a flicker of starlines, making a microjump. They reappeared seconds later, floating in a quiet pocket behind one of the system's distant planetoids. Lando immediately initiated a second jump, this time far from Endor, to random coordinates in the outer rim. The NAV computer spat out warnings about damage, uncertain if the jump would hold. "Do it anyway," Lando hissed. A new swirl of starlines enveloped them, and the Falcon was gone. Thus, by a thread, the Millennium Falcon escaped, carrying a handful of battered rebels. They would be among the only eyewitnesses to the Empire's total victory at Endor. In the days that followed, the news spread quickly across Imperial holonets. The Rebel Alliance had attempted to assault the new Death Star, but they were crushed at Endor. Emperor Palpatine emerged triumphant, unveiling his new flagship, the Eclipse, as proof of the Empire's renewed strength. With the Death Star partially damaged but still salvageable, the Emperor's propaganda machine sang praises of Imperial invincibility. In one swift stroke, the rebellion had lost its fleet, its heroes, and its Jedi. Regional governors scrambled to reaffirm their loyalty. Systems that had been on the fence about supporting the rebellion now hurriedly distanced themselves from any hint of sedition. Fear reigned supreme once more. The Emperor's plan was complete. By allowing the rebels to think the Death Star was unfinished, he had drawn them in. The final arrival of the Eclipse sealed their doom. Palpatine wasted no time consolidating power. Messages were sent to Moffs and admirals throughout the galaxy, proclaiming that open rebellion would no longer be tolerated. Those who had been rebellious would be dealt with harshly. With the Emperor's direct command, entire fleets fanned out, using the momentum of Endor's victory to strike at any hidden cells of resistance. On Coruscant, the Imperial capital world, celebrations and parades were held under the watchful gaze of the Imperial Security Bureau. Giant banners of Palpatine's face hung from skyscrapers. The HoloNet recounted the story of the traitorous rebellion's final defeat, praising the might of the Empire. The populace, with fear in their hearts, either cheered mechanically or kept silent. Stormtroopers marched in perfect columns through the city plazas. TIE fighters roared overhead, and the new flagship, the Eclipse, was depicted in triumphant broadcasts, overshadowing everything else in orbit. The Eclipse itself returned to Coruscant after a time, bearing the Emperor in unchallenged pomp. Thousands of Imperial loyalists thronged the spaceports, cheering as Palpatine's shuttle descended. A hush fell over the crowd as the ramp lowered, revealing the hooded figure, flanked by scarlet-robed guards. Palpatine surveyed the masses with a faint smile, as though a deity greeting worshippers. Meanwhile, a handful of scattered rebel survivors struggled in the outer rim. The Millennium Falcon nursed its wounds at a hidden location, possibly in a battered starport on some obscure planet. Lando Calrissian conferred with the few remaining rebel leaders who had been away on missions when Endor happened. One or two small cells remained operational, but their resources were meager. No one dared mount a direct challenge to the Empire now. The future of organized resistance seemed bleak, nearly impossible. Rumors persisted that some rebel ground forces were still alive on Endor, hiding amidst the devastated forests. But Imperial forces, loyal to Palpatine's decree, swept the moon methodically. ATS, TIE strafing runs, and an unrelenting search quickly dwindled the survivors' numbers. Han, Leia, Chewbacca, and their dwindling band of commandos evaded capture for a time, surviving on scrounged supplies, but each confrontation claimed more lives. Forced deeper and deeper into the mountains of Endor, they knew the noose was tightening. Walkers with floodlights clanked through the valleys. Probe droids soared overhead, scanning for life forms. Day by day, more rebels fell into Imperial hands, either captured or killed. Interrogations were brutal. The Empire wanted to publicize the capture of high-value rebels such as Leia Organa and Han Solo. One evening, after days of forced marches through mountainous terrain, the survivors halted in a concealed cave. Leia, pale with fever from the infected wound on her arm, leaned against the wall. Han tried to comfort her. "We'll find a way off this rock," he said, though his eyes betrayed the doubt gnawing at him. Chewbacca paced anxiously by the cave entrance. Of the original strike team, fewer than a dozen commandos remained, each exhausted and demoralized. That night, under the partial light of Endor's pale moon, the Empire found them. An entire squad of scout troopers, guided by probe droids, converged on the cave. The firefight was brutal and brief. The rebels returned fire, but their limited ammo and battered conditions made them easy prey. A trooper's stun blast took out Han. Another pinned Leia behind a boulder. Chewbacca roared in fury, firing a bowcaster shot that took down 2 troopers before a volley of return fire dropped him, moaning in pain. Leia fought on, ignoring her own injuries, managing to gun down a few Imperials, but she too was overwhelmed by sheer numbers. A stun bolt caught her in the back. She crumpled with a strangled gasp. The final rebel commandos fell or were cornered, forced to surrender. Thus Han, Leia, Chewbacca, and the last of their group were captured by the Empire on Endor. Word quickly reached the Emperor that the prized rebels were taken alive, including the famous Wookiee, Organa, and Solo. Palpatine, in his black-robed silhouette, gave a chilling smile. He ordered them brought to Coruscant for a public trial, an event that would further demoralize any lingering thought of rebellion. The trial, if it could be called that, was a spectacle broadcast across the galaxy. In the towering halls of the former Republic Senate chamber, now a hollowed-out stage for Imperial theatrics, the prisoners were paraded before thousands of spectators, overshadowed by towering banners of the Emperor. Holocams captured every angle. A dais was erected, upon which sat Palpatine in a throne-like seat. Advisors, Grand Moffs, and high-ranking officials flanked him, each in their crisp uniforms. Royal guards stood at attention, vibropikes in hand. Leia, still weakened, stood with determination, her hands bound in front of her. Han, exhausted, kept a protective stance near her, though he too was shackled. Chewbacca growled defiantly, muzzled by an Imperial device that suppressed his roars. The crowd murmured. In the highest boxes, those with special clearance observed. A few rebellious souls might have a flicker of pity in their eyes, but they dared not speak. One of the Emperor's advisors announced the charges in a booming, emotionless voice. Treason against the Empire, sedition, terrorism, murder of Imperial citizens, conspiracy, aiding and abetting Jedi criminals, and manifold other offenses. The crowd was encouraged to jeer. Palpatine raised a single hand, and silence fell. He rose slowly, leaning on a black cane. Long have these criminals hidden behind the ideals of a dead republic. His voice carried across the chamber. They sought to bring chaos to our galaxy, to undermine the peace and order we have established. They conspired with false prophets, Jedi illusions, and they have led countless innocents to their deaths. Today, we show the galaxy that such treachery will not stand. Han tried to muster his usual snark, but the weight of the entire situation pressed upon him, and words failed. Leia's gaze, though half-lidded with pain, burned with righteous anger. She might have said something, but her throat felt tight, as though a phantom hand squeezed it. She realized Palpatine was using the Force to silence her voice. To ensure our unity, and to deter any future uprising, Palpatine continued, "These criminals shall be punished by death." A hush fell over the entire chamber. Let all who watch know the price of rebellion. A series of troopers prodded the prisoners forward to a platform that extended out from the main dais. This platform overlooked a seemingly bottomless pit, a design reminiscent of ancient Sith architecture, ironically echoing the throne room where Vader and Luke had fallen. Holocams zoomed in. The galaxy watched. Leia's eyes brimmed with tears, for she felt the finality. No rescue was coming, no cunning plan would save them. Luke was gone. The rebellion was broken. She cast a last glance at Han, whose expression had become resigned, though he tried to reach out, hooking his arm gently through hers despite their shackles. Chewbacca rumbled, the muzzle preventing him from roaring in full. Their defiance, though admirable, was helpless now. Palpatine reveled in the tension. "If there are any final words you wish to speak," he sneered, "speak them now, though it will not change your fate." He allowed Leia to find her voice. Despite the fear, she mustered the last of her courage. The rebellion lives as long as people are oppressed," she said, her voice shaking but clear. "You can't kill hope." The Emperor's eyes glowed with disdain. "Hope is but a fleeting dream. Here, reality reigns." With that, he flicked his hand, and a trapdoor beneath the prisoners yawned open. They plummeted into the pit. The crowd gasped in a wave of hushed awe. Holocams captured the moment, broadcasting to the entire galaxy. A symbolic end to the rebellion's most famous heroes. With that final, public execution, any coherent leadership the Alliance had was gone. The Empire, triumphant, declared it a new era of security and dominion. The Emperor had no more illusions to maintain. The galaxy lay under his iron grip, enforced by legions of stormtroopers, fleets of star destroyers, and the unstoppable might of the Eclipse. Any planets that had harbored rebels found themselves blockaded or bombarded until they surrendered. No Jedi remained to challenge Palpatine's rule, and no formidable rebellion remained to unify the dissidents. Over time, the Empire expanded its territories even further, subjugating border worlds that had once been too remote or resistant. Imperial academies churned out new waves of officers and pilots, each indoctrinated into the might of the Emperor's unstoppable war machine. Taxation and resource extraction soared, fueling the reconstruction of the Death Star or the creation of new superweapons. Citizens were policed more heavily than ever, forced to pledge allegiance to the Emperor's vision of order. The HoloNet repeated the story of the rebellion's downfall, praising Palpatine for his foresight. Those who whispered of the atrocities risked being reported to the Imperial Security Bureau. Freedoms that had once lingered from the Republic era vanished. Political dissent became punishable by labor camp sentences or worse. The Senate had become an empty puppet show, if it was allowed to exist at all, merely a method for the Emperor to broadcast his edicts under a veneer of formality. On Coruscant, statues of Palpatine and monuments to the Imperial war machine rose in every district. The TIE advanced, proven lethal at Endor, became the staple of the Imperial Navy's starfighter corps. With each year, advanced technology replaced older designs, making the Empire's forces even more formidable. The Eclipse remained the personal flagship of the Emperor, an ever-present symbol of terror. There were always pockets of resistance, tiny cells that refused to bow. But without the cohesive leadership of Mon Mothma, Leia Organa, or the strategic brilliance of Admiral Akbar, they were easily contained, seldom rising to a threat that could challenge the Empire at large. The small group around Lando Calrissian in the Outer Rim attempted to rally other survivors, but they lacked ships, resources, and the morale. Over time, most of them scattered, trying to live in hiding, or fell to bounty hunters as the Empire's net spread far and wide. Eventually, the galaxy settled into a grim acceptance that the Empire was eternal. The shadow of the Emperor stretched across every sector, enforced by the memory of Endor's massacre. Years passed with Palpatine continuing his rule, sustained by the dark side, his body frail but his power unmatched. Rumors circulated about horrifying experiments, attempts to cheat death, but none could challenge him. In the hushed corners of a remote spaceport, travelers might speak in a whisper about the day the rebels almost destroyed the second Death Star. They might recall names like Skywalker, Solo, or Organa in reverent tones, like the last bright sparks of a dying flame. But the Empire's propaganda machine quickly snuffed out such talk. No one dared to openly celebrate those heroes. No one dared to remember them beyond whispered legend. Thus the galaxy remained in darkness, its one hope extinguished on that day when the eclipse arrived to seal the rebel fleet's fate, and when Darth Vader's final act of redemption was thwarted by the Emperor's unrelenting lightning. Luke Skywalker's noble stand ended in tragedy, and with his death, the Jedi were lost. The Empire marched forward unchallenged, forging an age of tyranny that no one could foresee an end to. And in the deeper currents of the Force, a heavy, sorrowful hush. The bright star that was Luke Skywalker had flickered out, the tenuous promise of balance undone. Darkness spread, thick and cold, leaving the galaxy under the Emperor's iron dominion for generations to come. Yet, in the quiet corners of existence, where the Force moves in mysterious ways, faint embers of hope could still glow, hidden from the Emperor's piercing gaze. But that is a story for another time, buried under layers of oppression and fear. For now, the Empire had truly won. The fires of the rebellion were doused, and from the black blade of the eclipse to the battered hull of the Death Star, the galaxy lay beneath Palpatine's unyielding rule, his victory at Endor reshaping history into one of unrelenting imperial supremacy.